Since Stephenie Meyer's Twilight came out, we haven't really been able to talk about love triangles in literature without dividing ourselves into teams. Teams named after the two romantic rivals. It might seem like a silly way to approach a text, but I think that teams can really resonate when the rivalry is not just between individuals, but between two greater possibilities. Better Meyer scholars than I am have already explained why Team Vampire versus Team Werewolf carry religious and even eschatological undertones that are based on imagery from the Church of the Latter-day Saints, which is Stephenie Meyer's church. Basically, Bella Swan is not just choosing which boy to date, but which state she wants to spend the rest of eternity in. And you have to admit that that's a pretty weighty question, even if it's put in a silly frame. But is it really a silly frame? Or are we just prejudiced against teenage girls? I ask that question now because we see the same frame in Under the Greenwood Tree, which was written by Thomas Hardy, one of the great writers of English literature. In this novel, one of the big questions is, who shall win the heart of the young, beautiful, and slightly immature Fancy Day? At first, it seems like no contest. The two rivals are the rich farmer, Shiner, and the poor tranter's son, Dick Dewey. And Fancy clearly prefers Dick, even if her father, for obvious reasons, thinks she should marry Shiner instead. And for a good part of their story, the conflict is not how Fancy shall be persuaded by each suitor, but how her father is to be convinced to let her follow her heart. But Dick's real rival is not someone who is essentially on the same footing as he. While Shiner is definitely richer and more settled, he and Dick are still kind of equals. They are both villagers in Mellstock, and should anything happen to the village in terms of modernization or fill in the blank with whatever wave of social or economic change is on the way, Shiner will be just as affected as Dick. The real threat to Dick's courtship of Fanny comes not from someone in their community, but from an outsider who can offer Fancy a lot more than either Shiner or Dick can. But the reader is just as surprised as Fancy is when the new vicar, Mr. Maybold, pays her a visit out of the blue and asks her to be his wife. He knows that it comes as a surprise to her. He knows that she doesn't love him yet and that a courtship may be in order, but he's also in a bit of a hurry. He doesn't want to court her. He wants to have her agree to be his fiancée immediately. And so what he offers is a little more than the usual love and faithfulness that a wife could expect from a husband. And I'd like to read a little bit of what he says to her, which seems to clinch the deal for him. Of course, we would not live here, Fancy. I have had for a long time the offer of an exchange of livings with a friend in Yorkshire, but I have hitherto refused on account of my mother. There we would go. Your musical powers shall still be further developed. You shall have whatever pianoforte you like. You shall have anything, Fancy, anything to make you happy. Pony carriage, flowers, birds, pleasant society. Yes, you have enough in you for any society after a few months of travel with me. Will you, Fancy, marry me? The full meaning of this may go over the average 21st century reader's head. I speak from experience. I had to do research to understand exactly what Mr. Maybold was offering Fancy, and it was quite interesting. The cornerstone of his proposal is Yorkshire. Yorkshire is in the north of England, while Hardy's Wessex is in the southwest. And in the 1870s, while the South was remaining close to its rural roots and not really developing, the North was industrializing at a pretty quick rate. Yorkshire, in particular, was seeing a lot of industry. It had steel, textiles, and coal mining. That means big factories, deep mines, harsh working conditions and living conditions for the laborers, and quite a bit of pollution, among other effects. But it also would have offered a vicar a much better living, that is to say, a much better salary than a small village like Mellstock would have. So much better that Mr. Maybold felt confident that he could promise Fancy luxuries like a new piano, her own pony and carriage, and a honeymoon on the continent. But of all the things that he is promising Fancy, I think it is the pleasant society which moves her the most. We know that Fancy had a mother who was a little more genteel than her father, and because of that, Fancy was raised with gentle manners and a refined accent. She went to a good school and learned a lot from books. She had musical training, and she actually did so well in her studies that she became a Queen's Scholar. What pleasant society means to her is intercourse with the middle class, which is arguably the class she belongs to, a class which values education and enjoys the new prosperity that has come with industrialization. And this is not something that she will be able to find with her neighbors in Mellstock. As lovely and wonderful as they all are, they will never be polished or refined or fashionable. So what Mr. Maybold is proposing is not just that he will uplift Fancy economically, but also that he will restore her to where she belongs socially. The choice put before Fancy is not just two different men, but two different Englands. A pastoral England which remains close to the land and which does have its rustic charms, and a more industrialized England which does seem to be leading the way to the future and which offers abundance and prosperity to average people beyond what they had imagined was accessible to them in the past. In my 5P review of Under the Greenwood Tree, which you can find in my 5P playlist, I said that I didn't really like that the Mellstock choir gave in a little too easily when the vicar told them that he wanted to disband the choir and replace them with an organ and an organist. I realize now that I had taken for granted that the choir was good. We'll never know because we can't listen to a book, but it's entirely possible that this group of very sincere but completely untrained musicians couldn't really harmonize very well or couldn't play their old-fashioned instruments very well. And it was this and not just village politics which convinced Mr. Maybold, the vicar, that it was time to bring in an organ, a modern instrument, and a trained organist to provide the music for the church. And it's possible that the choir themselves understood this. They knew that they weren't very good, and they had the humility to step down when a better musician came along. And of course, that younger musician is Fancy, a young woman who may still be a teenager, or at the very least in her early 20s, has taken over a job that men have been doing for decades, if not centuries. That is how superior Fancy is to the rest of the community in Mellstock. Now, she's not a snob about it. She gets along with her neighbors really well. She seems to enjoy village life. But when Mr. Maybold brings up pleasant society, it touches a nerve in her in a really big way. The question of which England you want to live in is pretty weighty. So why does Thomas Hardy leave this decision in the hands and the heart of a young woman who is, according to the text, still quite immature? On one level, it seems to be a satirical acknowledgement of the power that Victorian women had to affect the future, to say that they did want more prosperity and a different sort of life than the kind they had had for generations before. And on another level, it reflects the sense that these competing futures come to everyone who must make the choice the way a suitor would come to a young woman. In Under the Greenwood Tree, Fancy makes the choice that Hardy wants her to make, and pastoral England is preserved for at least one more generation. But outside Under the Greenwood Tree, what choice would the reader make? We kind of know what choice the contemporaries of Hardy made, and even those who chose differently were kind of outvoted there. But how does this apply to us, for whom the Industrial Revolution is history? We may no longer be interested in the land, but there is an increasing interest in what we have started to call analog life, in which we want to experience life in a more immediate way. We want to touch things, smell things, taste things without an electronic medium making it possible. We may not be as interested in close family ties as the characters in Hardy's novel are, but there is also a hunger for found family or closer community, neighbors we can speak to by walking next door instead of just texting or emailing all the time. And finally, we may not care about preserving these ancient religious or national traditions, but there is still a hunger, at least in my observation, for meaning that is beyond us and that can give a higher purpose to our lives. On the other hand, it does not escape my sense of irony that I learned much of this from the internet, or that BookTube, which is dependent on the huge servers of YouTube and the incredible infrastructure of the internet, which no one in the age of Thomas Hardy could have possibly dreamed. Not to mention the current accessibility of books that we enjoy now, without which BookTube would not exist. It does not escape my sense of irony that all these things are made possible by Team Yorkshire rather than Team Mellstock. Under the Greenwood Tree may have been written by a founding member of Team Mellstock, but this message and this video essay are brought to you by a slightly abashed member of Team Yorkshire. But something we readers have today that the original readers of Under the Greenwood Tree and Hardy himself did not is more historical perspective. Hardy possibly thought that if you did not choose Team Mellstock, it would be gone forever. We know now that after the initial devastation of the Industrial Revolution, a certain amount of stasis and balance came back, and that England, while it did not return to its former pastoral, bucolic state, has preserved quite a bit of its traditions and its way of life in its countryside. Or to put it more symbolically, using Hardy's own imagery, it's as if a descendant of Fancy and Dick fell in love with and married a descendant of Mr. Maybold, bringing the two worlds or the two teams together. Kind of in the way the daughter of Bella and Edward in Twilight fell in love with and married Jacob, bringing Team Vampire and Team Werewolf together in the end. And I hope everyone forgives me for this video essay.